Welcome to a unit on timing and coordination, which is really trajectory generation in robotic terms. So we talked about movement planning when we talked about in the vehicle part, right? And then we talked about behavioral dynamics in close loop with the environment essentially doing the planning, right? That was a particular way how we did planning, which was sort of reactive planning, and we compared it to the potential field approach, for instance, and that had therefore these movement plans were linked to sensory information like the perceived environment. You could update the plans based on that, and you in the vehicle, the target, for instance, was perhaps specified by such information. But the time when you reach the target was not actually a constraint. That was not specified. You were just driving with some speed to go there, right? And in our movement, we're much more typically talking about the time course of moving somewhere as something that is timed. And I'll explain that in a lot more detail across this talk. So time means that you achieve something at a given time, just at the right time. So in human movement, you have particular movement times, and actually Zhang, as I just announced, will be providing a whole lecture into how humans do that. They have very nice, smooth velocity profiles, and movement time is reproducible. And I'll say a little bit about that a little later. And it's certainly also something that is important in interacting with the world. Like if you want to catch something, right, you have to be at the right time, at the right place to interact with that object and catch it and so on. And that is actually something that is no longer fully feasible being just reactive, because in many cases there is some time that it takes to take your effector to the right place, to take some time to accelerate. It might even take in humans some time to get the muscles going or to do the neural computation. So you typically have to start all of that early enough in order to achieve the event that you desire, like intercepting an object. And that means there is some form of anticipation, some form of modeling. So that's a topic in time. So first I want to talk about that from the point of view of classical robotics, from a text point of view. I'll take again some examples here from the textbook I had mentioned earlier, and then I'll show you why we do that differently in autonomous robotics. But by conventional robotics, I mean programmed robots, right? That are not necessarily they don't have more than autonomous control. They don't do autonomous planning and decision making. So conventionally, movement plans are generated by these various algorithms that are hinted at for path planning for vehicles. When you think about robot arms, abstractly speaking, it's the same problem. It's just in a high-dimensional space, but you can think about paths being generated. These paths, so paths is sort of in the state space, or originally for vehicle was in the plane, but in robot arm it could be in the space of end effector configuration or in joint space, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And the idea would be that you have a parameter that takes you along the path, and that parameter is then mapped onto time with a particular profile that you specify, and then you give it to the robot to control. And we'll talk about how the control actually works. So I want to elaborate that just a little bit. So here's from the textbook are sort of the two extreme cases of how you could think of the plan. So for instance, you could think of the plan in joint space. If this example was just a two-joint arm, and you have a two-joint angle theta 1, theta 2, and you could think of a plan in the joint space as a path in the joint space, for instance, a straight path that you would then move along by varying this parameter s. So if this parameter s is 0, then you're at the start joint angle, and if it is 1, you're at the end value. Right? You see that the start value cancels, and so the parameter s controls where you're along the path. And conversely, if you want to do the same in end effector space, then you would have this kind of formulation. And then through inverse kinematics, you could compute that in joint space, and in joint space will be then actually not a straight path, right? This is a straight path in joint angles. This is a straight path in the end effector. So that's actually the old dilemma that goes through a lot of human motor control. There's always this question, does the nervous system plan in these terms or those terms? And it's actually often not so clear what exactly that means in the nervous system, because how do you know what planning even means in the nervous system? In robotics, these are two extreme cases of a whole set of possible planning strategies. You can see that the joint angle planning has some advantages in that it makes it easier to built in constraints from joint angles. So for instance, here, this gray area is sort of the reachable workspace for the robot arm. And you can more easily generate paths that lie within the reachable space so that you can actually achieve the movement. And you can steer free of singularities. And I'll show you in a moment, you can take acceleration constraints into account. On the other hand, end effector planning, end effector planning might not be so great because maybe you go through a portion that isn't reachable for your arm, for instance. But then sometimes you have problems on the corresponding problems in joint space. Or no, it's actually the same reflection in joint space, sorry. But what I want to say, in end effector space, planning is sometimes useful because that's where constraints are, for instance, about obstacle avoidance or about via points are going through particular regions in space to grab something and so on. And that's where your task typically resides. Typically, you have information about the task in that way. And so in the nervous system, there is a strong suggestion that we're doing things more in this style than in that style, which is one of the challenges, how we do that and how we then actually do the control. So for instance, human arm movements when directed objects typically are somewhat straight as paths. They tend to go too directly to the target from the initial position. And Lei Zhang in sort of 3 weeks will be showing you a lot of evidence about that. It's very interesting, actually. It's kind of amazing how human movement is so regular. So that's just the planning. And then I want to mention the fuller picture is, of course, that you typically want to move a tool like the 3D orientation of your hand as a human. And a robot would have a gripper arm, wants to position that in a particular way. And then really what you want to do is describe a path for that 6-dimensional object, the rigid body and its orientation, so which is captured by a frame that's attached to the tool. And then you have to talk about these 6-dimensional movements. And I'm not going to go into that. There is a mathematical formalism of how to talk about that. It uses the notions of twists and screws. So that's sort of the more general picture of what I just said about joint angles. And so then what you do is translate this into a time course by making this parameter that moves you along the path a function of time. Well, different approaches for that. I'll show you the pragmatic stuff in a moment, but theoretically, polynomials in time to the 3rd order are nice because you can actually determine the parameters of these such that you arrive at at the target, which would be the path parameter is 1 at a fixed time that you design. That will be your movement time, and you can arrange, for instance, for it to have 0 velocity at the target. So the movement planning problem with respect to timing is that you want to arrive at the target, not fall short, not overshoot, in a given time, and you want to arrive at it softly, that is, have 0 velocity at the target. And this form enables you to determine these parameters so that that is true. Even more demanding, perhaps you might want to also make acceleration 0, which means the velocity goes to 0 in some smooth way. And for that, you need a 5th order polynomial. And there are lots of other approaches, sort of generalizations of that, minimizing some cost function and so on, like minimum jerk is one of the models. So the 3rd derivative of the path parameter being minimized, and then you can impose smoothness constraints like that. So that's something that a lot of classical planners do. Industry robots actually often use much simpler procedures, which are easier to program. So for instance, there's ramps, they have maybe standard ramps, and then constant velocity pieces and standard ramps. So theoretically, there is infinite acceleration here, but then the controller smooths over that. That's not a problem. There are sometimes also explicit approaches where you smooth, like you have different segments here, and then there's a straight segment, and then they have a certain time function, like the spline, like a time function to connect these different pieces. So there's a whole industry of doing things like that, and typically those things are contained in the programming toolboxes for how to program trajectory generation in these robots. More sophisticated kind of ideas are ideas where you take into account constraints on acceleration. So you determine particular zones of the parameter derivative versus the parameter itself, right? This from 0 to 1 is the whole path, and then this would be the velocity. This is the parameter, and you have to now know in terms of joint acceleration, what joint accelerations you encounter where in this plane, and by modeling that you can determine certain zones that you don't want to enter, or certain subspaces on which you want to be. And that's how you can make sure that you're planning a motion that doesn't put joints to the limits, where for instance the actuators would encounter limits. So this is sort of somewhat related to dynamic window approach for vehicles. This is sort of the analogous idea in classical motion planning. Actually, originally was developed in this field, and it's part of some programming packages like that. I don't want to go more deeply into that. So this is a whole field. So if you look at classical robotics, there is the path planning problem, which is this complicated arm configuration problem, right? And then parametrizing the path in time, and that's called trajectory generation. That's the timing problem. And I didn't want to have another module on the path planning because it's just a higher dimensional version of the vehicle path planning we talked about. Now, these methods are used in the classical approach, the non-autonomous approach, and they are useful there because there you do have detailed models of the tasks, where you want to move, maybe even constraints like obstacle avoidance and so on. And you can also make the demand on the control system to guarantee that you're actually going to achieve that path, and you'll be able to track it. And typically planning and control, planning including timing and control, are totally separate in classical thinking, and there are some mathematical theorems that say in which sense that can be realized. So in autonomous robotics, that is not typically so easy. It's not easy because we're basing the constraints where you want to go, where you don't want to go, and how fast. We base that on sensor information, on modeling the world, perception, and that is not precise. Can make actually in systematic errors that might require online updating, because as we move, we might get more information. As an occlusion is, for instance, lifted, or the ball gets closer, we get better estimates when we catch a ball, let's say. And so the state of the art in autonomous robotics is that these things are based on heuristic approaches, so not exact approaches that guarantee soft arrival, because we don't actually have very good or very precise estimates of the physical environment, but instead heuristic approaches that would tend to get you, but that are robust against misestimations or updates of the estimation. And you will see that in a couple of examples that I'll take you through. So I first now want to just illustrate certain approaches that I don't explain in detail. Actually, if you look inside those systems, they're a little bit complicated hodgepodge connections of algorithms. Then I'll take you through human motion timing coordination, which is sort of the model for a certain class of these solutions for autonomous robotics. And I was involved in some of that work, and I'm one of those who did that very cleanly in the sense of analytical models that you can really understand. And then some of these ideas are actually part of the state of the art now, but they are now totally integrated in very complex systems. And so I'll show you some examples toward the end of the lecture that might be next week, that are not so easy to fully understand, but you can sort of then extrapolate from the concepts I'll tell you how they might be done inside. That's my plan. So first, let's talk about timing in autonomous robotics more more just macroscopically. So an influential idea goes back to someone called Koryciak, even though, frankly, I'm not sure if he was really the originator. He's often cited for that. I think he might be the originator. I'm not, maybe Rybert, whom I mentioned in a moment, who has priority. I don't know exactly. So roughly that idea is to say, if I want to interact with the world in a way that involves timing, involves being at the right point in the right time, I ultimately have to build a model of that world. So here, this model system is a juggling robot. It's a robot that has a paddle, and it wants to bounce a ball on that paddle. So it always has to hit the ball at the right time so that it keeps it going. Right? There would be a task that involves timing. It's obvious that you have to hit the ball at the right phase of its cycle, so that you can transmit momentum and it keeps going. The problem of keeping the ball over the paddle, let's ignore that for the moment. In this model, it's actually solved by servo control. They have some camera that observes the ball. The ball has some color, very easy to distinguish from the background. And they just control where that paddle is. Actually, it's more complicated. They control, in fact, the exact inclination angle of that paddle in a servo control way. So if it deviates to one side, then you incline the paddle a bit. That next time it will be closer to the work area that you want to do, with some kind of ad hoc servo algorithm. So that's not special. But where in the cycle do I hit the ball to keep it going? And so the idea at that time was to say, well, timing is, here's periodic task, keep this going. And you'll see later that timing is always somehow embedded in periodic thinking. And what I need, so what physically happens is that the ball falls, rises and falls according to Newton's law. We can sort of model that dynamically, how it does that. And I'm just transmitting a momentum. So if I know the velocity with which I hit the ball, assuming the ball is elastic, I can sort of model my insertion into this dynamics. And what they now said, well, maybe what I can do is I can generate a motion of that robot arm that delivers a particular term to the mathematical equation that describes the ball's motion, right? That will be Newton's law, write it down, the differential equation for that. And then Newton's law will just make that initial velocity goes up and then falls down, right? x2 dot equals g, that's the model. And now you want to insert into that equation certain terms that depend on the position of the ball and the velocity of the ball, so that the equation as a whole has a stable periodic solution, which is called a limit cycle. So I'm not going to explain to you exactly how that works, but that's sort of the idea. And that will be what the paddle, what will describe the paddle motion. And it turns out that works. Some movement emerges. The exact amplitude that the ball will have will depend on parameters of that equation, that some of which are empirical because not all analytically solved, but it works. And that idea has had a lot of influence. So another version, and again, I don't know historically, maybe this idea came first, I don't know that. Someone called Mark Rybert, very famous at the MIT, he led a lab for autonomous locomotory systems. And then he's the founder of Boston Dynamics. So some of you will know Boston Dynamics from videos. I'll show you a video in a moment. A company that creates legged robots, and very cool ones too. So one claim to fame from this lab is the so-called one-leg hopping machines. This kind of machine, which does the same sort of thing that Koryciak did with a paddle. That is, it's a machine that hops up and down, has a single leg. And so it has two tasks. It has the task of periodically hopping down, so transmitting enough momentum so that it will, somewhat regularly hit the ground, and staying upright. And staying upright is again controlled by controlling the angular inclination of this hopping leg according to also sort of a simple servo controller. You have some accelerometer on the system. You estimate the acceleration of center of mass, and you see if the center of mass begins to drift off in a certain direction. Then you incline the leg in a way to transmit momentum at the next hop that would counteract that drift. And that's how you can stay in place and control where it goes. And then you simply make the movement of the leg periodic. Again, you make it dependent, state dependent, so that the complete system, so the dynamics of this mass is a rigid body that has a particular trajectory, plus that actuation that you wrote down, make a periodic solution, a limit cycle solution. And so that has been sort of abstracted. There's a proposal, the full and Kodychek proposal, they call this the template anchor metaphor. So it's an idea that one would have a level of description that's abstract, that's body in space, where you generate a mathematical basis for creating periodic solutions, and that you then insert the state variable that you obtain from a model like that, as you simulate on the on the computer of the robot, and then you connect that to the actuator that controls that system, act it out and get some measure of its macroscopic state, again, like its center of mass in the world, to update your equation. That's part of that equation that you have here, so that you essentially decouple the details of the actuation from this. This model could be viewed as the timekeeper, the oscillator that keeps the time. Again, I'm not explaining that in exact detail. So that conceptually, that model is very influential, and it's at the basis of some of these neurally inspired dogs. I don't think I want to fully explain that. You see, you have to do more things. You have to also maybe coordinate multiple legs that you have. You might have to state machine controls whether you are currently in the free flight for the foot in the swing phase, or the phase where you interact with the ground, and you have to activate different controllers and so on. And in this last lecture that Rashid Ramadan will present to you, he will take a bipedal locomotory model of humans and actually make concrete sense of that, so in much more detail than here. So I wanted to show you this video. I assume that many of you have seen things like that, right? This is Boston Dynamics, an advertisement robot, and you see these vehicles running around. You might know that these are now state of the art. They have a commercial version for this, and this is demo video. So this is much more complex. There's many more things than what I'm hinting at, but here you see the demonstration of stability. So there are several ideas here. So one is this timing, the periodic timing of the legs that makes these time movements. And you see the time movement can be modulated to stabilize the gait. And that so it means advance in time or delay in time the footfall to transmit the correct stabilizing force to the robot. It also has to do, of course, the coordination among these different limbs, and it has to deal with the extent of the leg motion to keep the robot upright. So all of this balancing, and this robot doesn't have a detailed model of these steps. So it's all based on updating the parameters for the next movement based on the previous movement, always with respect to the momentum transmitted to the center of mass, so that the robot doesn't fall over. It's really, really cool stuff, right? Okay, back to the lecture. You did see those slides, right? This worked, I suppose. Yeah, you were able to see them. Yeah, thank you. Good. So that's sort of just to give you an idea. Now let's talk a little bit about the underlying concepts. See, these ideas clearly are already imported a little bit from biology. Some of these researchers originally looked at legged animals, central pattern generators, ideas from that. I'm not going to review that entire history. I take my human movement, which just because that's where I work, but a lot of animal movement has been studied with respect to timing as models for such things. Locomotion is a special case in that locomotion has a lot of demands that are also control demands, right? Physically keeping system upright and acting against the ground reaction forces and so on. So I don't want to go into all of that. Now we're looking at the opposite limit case, and we're looking at timed movement that is little constrained by these other problems, pure timing in a sense, and we get some ideas from that. So I'll use this little excursion into human movement to actually really define timing a little bit better, talk about absolute versus relative timing. I'll define what coordination is, and I'll introduce more formally this notion of coupled oscillators as the basis for timing. And then I'll take you into how we can use that to build robotic systems that do timing. So first, let's talk about absolute versus relative timing. So here I made by hand two noisy traces of something which I call activation here. This is from a paper in which we talk about possible neural substrates for timing, and we're assuming some neurons whose firing rate, or I don't know, membrane potential, some physical set of the neurons is modulated periodically in time, and that would be generating some time course. And you would think that there's some event. For instance, here I'm suggesting that the moment this activation goes through a threshold, something happens, like maybe some muscle gets driven or some physical event happens. So when it goes from below to above threshold, that's where the event happens. That's where these lines come from. And so I made this on purpose somewhat noisy. It was done by adding noise to an oscillator to highlight what the problem is. So you see that these times when the threshold is pierced varies. Like this is a long interval, and this is a shorter interval, and there's a long interval again, and so on. So when you think of a single activation variable like that, and that would drive, for instance, your movement, you would be tapping or playing the drum, then you would have some variability there, which would be an error. I call that in absolute timing. That is how much time elapses between the two events. That's, if this was a clock, then this would be a very variable clock, and you would say there is some error over time in how well it keeps the clock, because the cycles are not totally reproducible. On the other hand, here the relative time is about the relationship in time of two kinds of events. So the second is, in this case, just another activation trace that is also roughly periodic. And so I can do the same kind of analysis for the second clock. But I can also ask, how well are these two clocks aligned in time? That would be relative timing. And I've arranged in this case that in some intuitive sense, they are better aligned in relative time than in absolute time. So again, see here, these would be the so-called cycle times from event to event, always taking the threshold piercing as event. So you see intuitively it's quite variable, again, this long and the short. And you see this is sort of similar in the two traces. And that makes that the two traces are well aligned. So for instance, if I just look at the misalignment, that will be the interval dc, which is between the event in one of these traces versus in the other trace. That is a relatively small number. You see here again, here again. Here it's even very small, and so on. A small number compared to the variability in that time interval itself. You could measure that relative timing by looking at the ratio of this time difference between the two traces. Again, time difference of comparable events, or corresponding events, divided by the cycle time, the time between these events in one of those cycles. You could take one of the cycles as a reference, or the others, doesn't really matter. That would be a so-called relative phase, and you could normalize it the way I suggest here. You would normalize it to go from 0 to 1. So when that dg becomes very large, then you're really looking at the next cycle as the reference cycle. Another way of looking at it would be to multiply that with 316. You would consider it an angle in a phase plane. And you could also multiply it with 2 pi when you are a more theoretically inclined person, and measure it in radians, right? It's periodic in the sense that, let's say, if this event gets more and more delayed, it would ultimately approach this event and go on the other side. And then when it goes on the other side, then we'd say, I'm back to a small relative time, because now this is the reference cycle. And I would just drop one cycle time from delta t and put it back into the interval from 0 to 1, or from 0 to 360. Right? So relative phase is always an angular-like variable that is periodic in nature. So these are very different concepts, and this illustration shows that you could be a very precisely timed. So this is an example where two things are very precisely aligned in time, but they're quite variable. Sort of more unusual thing. The other thing is you could have, for instance, two very precise clocks that are very good in absolute timing, like a digital watch or something. But for instance, they could be not very well aligned in relative timing if they're not physically coupled. Right? If you, for instance, you have a classical analog watch and your neighbor has another watch, and these two watches are very precise, but if there's nothing physical between them, they would drift against each other. Let's say one watch advances by 1 second over 24 hours, which maybe not such a good watch, but it used to be that used to be very good for mechanical watches. That would mean that the phase difference between those goes through any angle from 0 to 360 degrees over 24 hours. So the variability in relative time would be large, but in absolute time it would be small. So see that. So these two are really different concepts. So let's first think about absolute timing. So absolute timing is typically measured in periodic tasks, even though you could, I'll come to that, also think about that in a single event when you do something only one time. So periodic case, of course, music, right? And asking you to estimate time, what is here an interval between two notes, and say which is shorter or longer, or prediction, right? If you anticipate something, somebody switches on a machine, you turn your gaze to that because you're predicting how long it will take for it to start up. And we do that all the time in daily life. We have subtle predictions about, when you drive, you have some expectation how quickly the effects of what you do will show up, and you will be immediately alerted when that prediction doesn't match. That is true actually in humans across many different time scales. So here I'm talking about movement, but if you think about just prediction, that you can do that on a large time scale. It's famous that animals very quickly develop prediction at what time of the day certain events happen, like the dog shows up for the food at a certain time, or the door expecting the owner, and things like that. But here I'm talking about movement time. In movements, it's sort of in a range of seconds where we have this perception. So a typical laboratory task to look at absolute timing is just tapping. When you have to hit like a drummer, hit some surface. Drummer is actually a bit special because in the drummer, you're using the mechanical resonance of the drum as part of the timing, and people can actually make much higher frequency movements than they can move by getting into resonance. So that's misleading. But let's say if you think of piano playing or tapping on a surface, that would be a typical periodic task that we use to just look at pure timing. There is something, I want to say three things about that. First of all, I want to say that if you do tapping, it is actually always active and anticipatory. It is not, that like you hear your previous tap and that drives your next tap, or purely reactive that way. For instance, when you follow a metronome, let's say somebody plays a metronome, you go along. Then you typically will align the physical event, like the sound that you make when you tap, with a physical event that gives you the rhythm, like the metronome sound, for instance, or a visual signal. So align means that the difference between those is small, like a few milliseconds, right? So clearly the time that it would take to perceive the event and then trigger your response to it would be too large. You wouldn't be able to hear the sound and then tap in response within a few milliseconds, right? It takes 150 milliseconds in the best case to make a reaction time. So what you actually have to do is have to anticipate, right, to generate your movement, because you're predicting where the sound will next be. So this form of timing always involves some form of prediction. And that shows up in that when you're asking people to do this, they will typically start to be self-paced. Let's say you do a metronome, follow the metronome, and then you turn off the metronome. You can try that with yourself. then you will keep tapping. And maybe then you stop when you notice the metronome's gone off, but spontaneously will continue because you're actually making the prediction of the next sound, and that's already driving your movement system, and only then will you pay attention to how well it was aligned with the auditory event. In fact, this is one of the dominant paradigms, so-called self-paced versus externally paced. So typically you set up a rhythm by having a metronome, and then you turn off at a certain point, and then people can be instructed to just keep going. And that they will keep going with that frequency. They will drift over a longer run, but they can quite well reproduce the frequency. That's how you can impose different frequencies on these rhythms. When they do it without a metronome, you call that self-paced, and that's when you can sort of study the property of the timer. When you do it with an external metronome, it's actually, there's a relative timing between you and the metronome, of course, too. And again, it's not purely reactive. The other little aspect of that is relates to this schematic figure, is that if you look into the detail of these events, it turns out that there are really specific events in the movement that are aligned. So for instance, if you tap, like in the piano playing kind of situation, you tap a key or keyboarding, then it turns out that the aspect of the movement that is very precisely aligned in time with, let's say, a metronome, or that repeats very well from cycle to cycle, is typically a specific one. Very often it's like the peak downward velocity, sometimes the acceleration, something, the physical hitting the table could also be close to that, while other parts might be more variable in time. For instance, the lifting up could be more variable in time. So there are sometimes discrete events in such tasks that are really aligned. And that will be a topic you will see toward the end of this lecture, that timing actually interacts with what we call behavioral organization, that is the sequential activation of different actions. Here is always perhaps the same action, but different instances of that action. So that itself, the initiation of an action can be timed, as is the concrete movement. So humans are very good with absolute timing. So for instance, if I set you up to follow a metronome, let's say at 2 hertz, 2 per second, something like that, then if you tap that and I turn off the metronome, you're supposed to continue. The variability as measured in, it should have that standard deviation, so in the same units, the variability can be less than 5% of a cycle time. So at 500 milliseconds, that can be better than what is it? 5 milliseconds would be 1%, so it would be like 20-30 milliseconds, so quite precise. You can actually be more precise than 10 milliseconds with your timing. So that's quite impressive. And so we're very good timekeepers and time predictors. It's maybe very intuitive. You look at music, right? And musicians transmit very tiny differences through variations in time that are small in percent of the cycle time. There are a certain kind of analysis, which I don't want to explain in detail, that looks at the variance of such intervals and the 2 components of that variance. And the message from this picture is that as cycle time increases or frequency decreases, that variance goes up. So the slower your rhythm, the larger the variance of the intervals that you produce. And you could say that when it goes into seconds, this is 2 hertz, so 500 milliseconds here is the slowest. And then if you go to 1 hertz, actually, so beyond the 6-7 hertz, you're no longer anywhere near as good. Then it's more like you have to mentally count and do something else to keep time, and you become very variable. So it's actually perhaps initially surprising, the longer the time, the more variable. It's not so surprising if you think about it, because if you normalize the variance by the cycle time, then it's about constant. So that's why I'm talking about the percent. Actually, the question somebody asked about one rhythm with one hand and another rhythm with the other hand. I will actually be talking about that in a moment. That is coordination. I can talk about that forever. So that's a fun question. I'll come back to that question in a moment. Yeah, so that's a signature of how we do motion, that was the variability of our timing is constant in percent of the cycle, roughly speaking. So as you have larger cycle time, in absolute term, it becomes larger. And that's a signature that can be analyzed in more specific detail that one can explain. Just hint at that detail. You could say there is a part of your variance. When you have a certain cycle, some variance that comes from one event varying or the other event varying, right? And you could see that gives rise to correlated times. Like, for instance, if you have two cycles and the middle event is varying, then it induces some correlation that this cycle becomes longer and the next cycle becomes shorter. And you can sort of subtract that out and look at the pure motor variance, which will be just the event varying, and that's this year, versus the variance that is, that is affected by this correlation. That's this variance here. So the theoretical picture for how timing happens is limit cycle oscillators. That's actually the mathematical theory of clocks. Clocks are just that, limit cycle oscillator. Now, I introduced the notion of a limit cycle oscillator, a stable limit cycle oscillator, in the dynamic systems tutorial. I'll refer back to that in a moment. When we looked at the Hopf bifurcation, and there's a limit cycle oscillator that arises there. So mathematically, what that is it's just a periodic solution that is stable, that is from any initial condition nearby, you're attracted to that periodic solution. So it's a generalization of the notion of fixed point to a periodic solution that is stable. The Hopf normal form is the one where the periodic solution is a real sinus function, a beautiful sinus function. The amplitude of that sinus function goes, from, I didn't plot that here, but it's the square root of the bifurcation parameter. I'm reminding you of this equation. We use this equation in that tutorial lecture because we'll be using that in some of the robotic models. Remember, that has a linear part, which has sort of the damping parameter or stability parameter on this axis, and the frequency omega, which is 1 over the cycle time, right? The omega and cycle time are reciprocal to each other on the off-diagonal axis, and then has a nonlinear term, which makes this a stable thing. That nonlinear thing just means that if you're going very far from the limit cycle, it will be negative. It will push you back. If you transform this into polar coordinates, it's like the r⁴ term of the pitchfork bifurcation kind of model, right? In polar coordinates, this equation just has this for the polar variable and then this for the angular variable. And this means, of course, that phi, the phase, is just advancing at a constant rate. So it's a linear function of time. That's why you have this omega t. And the solution of this is omega t, gets in here, and then you have a sinus function or cosine function for the amplitude. So this is just to remind you, this is a limit cycle. I haven't talked about that in a lot of detail. And the theory of clocks is really that clocks are limit cycles. So this has been studied for instance, by some Russians, Andronov and Witt, in the 1920s, to describe electronic oscillators. This was this time of the valves. It's kind of funny that in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of mathematical and theoretical work about that, and they also used analog computation for longer and a lot more than in the West. It's interesting, had a very strong dynamical systems tradition, while in the West there was more a filter theory kind of tradition for thinking about, for instance, control. And the dynamical systems tradition lends itself actually more to understand stability and timing and so on. And the filtering tradition really more to fixed points. So that's where some of that theory comes from. But even, like the grandfather clock that has a nonlinearity instead of this very smooth nonlinearity, has so-called escapement when you inject a little energy at the end of that, the outer limits of that cycle. Or you have, the mechanical watch, which has a spring and an escapement that also injects energy whenever it hits the limit. And then, of course, electronic cycles and electronic watches are just electronic circuits that oscillate, right? Oscillatory circuits, down to atomic clocks, which use excitation in an atom that is periodically produced, and you inject energy, electric energy, to keep that going. So it's all oscillators. And neural networks are oscillators. So those who went to winter semester course are familiar with the two-layer neural network, which we consider them fields, and the generic property of one of them excitatory. This would be excitatory, this would be inhibitory. So the inhibitory neuron here has a negative influence on the excitatory one, while the excitatory neuron here is both self-excitatory and also excites the inhibitory neuron. If you analyze the generic equation for that, then it has oscillatory solutions. In fact, it has these very so-called relaxation oscillators that look sort of non very harmonic, sort of edge-like. So it switches. There's a switch here. Whenever you go through zero, you see this in this shape here. And sort of that's the thought of essentially in the brain, wherever you have time phenomena, you have neural oscillators like that. You can have those in the spinal cord. They are called central pattern generators. You have them in higher cortical areas like in motor cortex itself. There are also some highly specialized oscillators that mix electrical and chemical stuff for slower rhythms, like the diurnal rhythm, that tells you what time of day it is based on chemistry being so slow, some kind of chemical oscillator, and we know something about the neural basis. So even you might think, the other way of measuring time is just having some event unfold, like, the classical hourglass, like the sand going through this narrow heap and heap forming, and it takes a certain amount of time for all the sand to go through that bottleneck. And so you think then of the amount of sand or the amount of activation accumulating as being sort of the measure of time. So if you know that function, you can read off the filling level of the watch as being, as a measure of time. Of course, that's actually not really how it's done. How it's done is that you only look at the events when the reservoir is empty, and then you have to reset the watch. The hourglass is actually only a good timekeeper if somebody really watches it and resets it exactly when, so turns it around exactly when it's empty. So in antiquity, when this was the only reliable watch or a clock, artificial clock, other than the sun cycle, a clock that will have higher resolution, the very, very important thing is to turn the hourglass when it's on, just on time, when it's empty. And in the Navy, in navigation, it's very important to keep time so that you can tell where you are along the longitudinal. And people had to turn the hourglass. That was a very, very important task. And if you were bad at that, you would be strongly penalized. So only with the reset does it become actually a clock, and then it's a special case of a limit cycle oscillator. I argued in a paper here about that because some psychologists use this image, not with sand, but with activation as being timing. And some of them neglect this fact that the resetting is very important. So conceptually, timing is really always linked to oscillation, even if you're making a single cycle. And I think I cut that from this lecture, but you could imagine that you have a system like this that is a neural oscillator, but you can arrange for that system such that when you go around, you stop after one cycle. For instance, could be because you have an attractor that can be on either side of this barrier, and when it's on this side, it actually stops being an attractor, and you go around, and then while you go around, the attractor slips back, and then you stop. That's so-called active transient. And in the winter semester, I actually am alluding to this. And you find that in the nervous system quite a bit. In fact, the individual spike events, if you remember my neurophysics lectures, those of you who've seen my winter semester lecture, they know the little neurophysics lecture on Hodgkin-Huxley and spikes. The spike event is like that. You make a complete spike, and then you go back to resting level. That's an active transient. It just happens once under some conditions. And it is a timing signal because its time form is reproducible. It has a particular time form that it autonomously generates, but it doesn't necessarily continue periodically. It has a particular mechanism of being switched on, and then under typical conditions, it will not continue. There are also conditions where it will continue, which are called burst cells, but in many cases, it will do just a single spike. So I also call that an oscillator because mathematically it's actually just an oscillator that's being turned off in the sense of being made unstable at the right point. And you will see in some of the robotic examples, we're actually using exactly that technology. That is, we're turning on and off oscillators and making sure that it always happens at a full cycle. And then we're using the watch-like aspect, the clock-like aspect of the stable oscillation for the timing. And then the turning on and off doesn't have to be precisely timed. Okay, so I'm just saying from this earlier work that models like that explain the data about human timing. So there are some empirical support that this picture is right even for absolute timing. And I'm not going into the details of that. Now, so much about absolute timing. We can talk a lot more about that, but just a rough idea. Now, the other thing is relative timing, right? Relative timing about multiple components. For instance, in locomotion, you have interlimb timing as a bipedal animal, right? You want to alternate your legs. You don't want to, if you make it at the same time, you have to do hopping or jumping. There is also intralimb timing. That is, if you move an individual limb, different muscles have to fire always at the right time relative to each other for the trajectory to retain its shape. If you think of something as like speaking, it's a very complex coordination problem where multiple actuators, we call those actually articulators in speech, have to arrive at the right point at the right time relative to each other. For instance, now for doing a b, I have to make sure that the upper lip and the lower lip meet at the right point to make the so-called bilinear lip closure that is important for a sound like b. Mastication, right? Kauen, when you eat. That is a complicated dance where your tongue pushes some food somewhere so that the teeth can hit it. It's when you occasionally bite your own tongue and then you notice how it really requires coordination, right? That the different parts have the right timing relationship to achieve the function. And you're not recommended to try it both at the same time because the coordination task can be a little bit difficult. And playing music is an example of that. So it's very easy to think of coordination, the relative timing of multiple components in rhythmic tasks, but there are things like that in discrete tasks, right? For instance, when you reach and grasp, you do something like that, you approach an object, and then typically you close just at the right time when you're at the object to grasp it. And if you handle manipulate something, like you handle something and insert something else with the two hands, you coordinate. In grasping, you coordinate the multiple fingers to achieve the grasp. And of course, coordinating with perceived events, like if you're catching a ball, intercepting something, hitting a ball, or catching an animal, and things like that. So more formally, coordination really is the stabilization, I here say a maintenance of a stable timing relationship, or stabilization of a timing, of relative timing. So stabilization means really that if one of the components is delayed, the other component also delays to catch up in time, to be again temporally aligned, and vice versa. Something is accelerated, the other is also. So when you're tapping, you're doing something like that, right? If your metronome, if your tap comes too early, then next time you're delaying a little bit, and if it comes too late, you're accelerating a little bit to keep it temporally aligned. In fact, you can follow a slowly changing metronome. You can track that by keeping things aligned that way. There is very interesting work that just highlights that in speech. Maybe I'll gloss over that. In speech, there are very subtle effects like that. And so it's the stabilization against perturbations, like catching up after a perturbation, that is sort of the operational signatures of something being really coordinated. Well, it could, of course, have that two things are aligned in time just by chance. But then you would say, if I perturb, then they're not going to try to get back to the correct relative timing. And we'll elaborate on that a little later. So you could ask yourself, so when I move multiple things, are they always coordinated? And in the human in human movement and a lot of animal movement, that is true for a lot of skills. And that's maybe why it's even kind of difficult to see that there is something special about coordination. But it's not necessarily true. For instance, when you're moving, like walking around, and you're being delayed, might be like a traffic sign or an obstacle, or you talk to someone, your arrival at some target is not timed, in the sense, if after a perturbation like that, you do not typically now try to catch up to run faster so as to arrive at the same time. I mean, you might actually, if you think you're late, you might run, but there is actually no special regulation that you arrive at the same time. You might then arrive earlier, but there's no direct perception of whether the relative time in between what actually, right? The events are not really well defined. When two people are walking, they can actually coordinate. So we can coordinate our locomotion. So for instance, sometimes see this in children, that if they walk with an adult who is not very attentive, the child might not actually be able to keep up, and then might occasionally break into running to keep up. And so they are spatially aligning, and that means also they align their velocity in time. And you have that, let's say if in baseball, this is famous because, run to catch a ball, and you have to be at the right location to catch. And so there the running is timed in some sense, even though actually it's done a little bit differently than in other cases. But so per default, the path planning that we were discussing earlier for vehicles isn't timed. That is, the vehicle just takes as long as it takes. If it drives with a speed, it could moderate that speed. If it has to drive around an obstacle, it will take longer. And I'll actually be coming back to that probably next week, to an example where we try to introduce an element of timing into a behavior like that. So timing and coordination is more than just doing something in time. It really means that you control time, that is, to stabilize time against perturbations. And absolute timing, that will mean you're trying to go to a particular fixed interval, and therefore controlling the time that elapses between two events. And in coordination, it means that you're trying to get back to a particular alignment of two time traces, one of which could be perceptual, and then it's timing with external events. Okay, so that's the notion of coordination. Now I want to show you a concrete example. This is from my own earlier work. It's a little bit special, but this is a example that sort of is the signature for coupled oscillators making coordination. That's sort of the theme, and that idea has been used for robotics. So I'll tell you the example. It's a bit special, but in the end you will see it's worthwhile. So this is based on an observation that in natural movement, you have two forms of coordination very typically. So in-phase coordination means that two things that are, you compare, let's say, two fingers is the example I'll be doing, or to a drummer or whatever. In-phase would mean that corresponding events occur synchronously. Let's say, flexing, corresponding events would be at the same time. In gallop, roughly speaking, the two legs are actually a slight phase delay, but in hopping, it would be very clearly in phase. And then the anti-phase would be alternation, right? So for instance, this would be alternation, right? There will be the corresponding events alternate, sort of one is in the middle of the movement of the other. For instance, in music, in phase would be the normal synchronization, that you hear the beat and then you're on the beat, you're doing the movement. And syncopation is what jazz musicians call that, is when you hear the beat and you're always going in between the beats, right? It's supposed to be a bit more sophisticated. And in trot, you would say the different limbs on left and right, they are alternating. Of course, in bipedal locomotion, that's the only thing we can do, right? We can only do interface, except no, we can actually do hopping, yeah, but as a locomotory gauge. So these two patterns are very common. If you look into the animal kingdom, you see them everywhere. You could roughly say they are reflections of the underlying neural networks being either excitatorily coupled, so they would tend to coactivate, or inhibitorily coupled, so when one is going, the other one is suppressed. And that's probably roughly why we see these patterns. Now, I'm just mentioning this here because this fact can be used to explore, to expose something about how these coordination patterns come about. And so slowly I'm approaching Richard Koebel's question. So when in this experiment that Scott Kelso came up with, a couple other people who contributed to that, I worked with Scott Kelso as a postdoc, and I did my start in movement science by modeling these kind of things and making some predictions about that stuff. I'll not go into the details here. So what he sort of discovered is that you can have transitions between these different patterns of coordination. His idea was it's like going from trot to gallop, the horse speeding up and going from trot to gallop, which actually horses do. And you can actually also show that they show some of the signals I'm talking here. It's a much more difficult experiment to do. Here he had people just do finger movements. The finger movements, I'll say something about in a moment. And he started them out, for instance, in an in-phase or an anti-phase pattern measured by the relative phase, and then just asked them to speed up. And then he would observe that it would sometimes switch into in-phase. They can't do the anti-phase at high frequencies. And so the notion, there was some kind of complicated history of thought, is that that is an instability in the sense that we've been discussing of a dynamical system instability. In fact, my work was about proving that. So here's an example. You can observe muscles and so on. It's not so important. It's often even done this way, even though it's very awkward, or you can do it this way. But it's actually not by chance that you would use fingers for that, because the fingers are very light, and so there are very few mechanical constraints. It's not like the inertia of the fingers plays a big role. And they're not mechanically coupled. So if you move your legs, the whole body center of mass will be oscillating, and so there will be mechanical coupling between the limbs, while the fingers are negligibly coupled mechanically. So they're very good to just look at the neural mechanisms. They would be aligned in time just because of some neural phenomenon. And so what happens, so again, you started on these two different phases, and you pace with a metronome the frequency, and you find that transition. Here's an example where you see the individual traces. You see here these markers up there. The solid one is for one finger, the dash one for the other finger. You see here they are alternating. One finger reaches peak at the opposite phase than the other. And then here they're in phase, and somewhere in here they made the transition. You can observe this also by estimating the relative phase in the way I hinted, where you measure these events, or there's actually a continuous way of measuring relative phase based on some phase plane reconstruction. I'll neglect that. And so you're interested in that transition, and it turns out that there are two measures of stability that one can use to estimate whether the transition is based on a lack of stability. I'll explain that a little more in a moment. You can look at variance, so fluctuations in time or from experiment to experiment. So here, typically you had multiple cycles where the frequency was the same, and then you would increase the frequency to the next step, and then multiple cycles. So over these cycles, when the frequency was constant, you could look at the variability from cycle to cycle of the relative timing measured in some way. And that will be using the fluctuations as a measure of stability. And the other is relaxation time. So literally what was done is perturbed mechanically the fingers. People were moving, and you had some manipulation. You put your finger in a little motor that would actually really mechanically perturb your finger strongly enough to really hit its phase. And there's a whole technology about how to make sure you actually hit the phase, and but not to rip out the finger, right? It would be just tolerable. And then after that perturbation, you would look at how long it takes to get back to the rhythm. I think I have slides here. Yeah, here's an example. So this would be, you see here the perturbation is induced. You see this finger here makes a little recursion. It's a little bit upset here, and then it goes back into an alternation figure. This is in velocity space, in position space. This is when you measure this continuous relative phase. Here the same is done in the in-phase rhythm. Here's the injection perturbation. You see then it's a little transient, and you'll see it's pretty much back in phase here from this point on. So this already illustrates that in phase you're faster than in anti-phase in this example. And that's what actually empirically happens. What you find is that as you increase frequency, the variability sorry, here the variability in the anti-phase pattern goes up until then you switch and then it drops to the in-phase level. And similarly, the time to recover after perturbation goes up in a way that can be predicted from that first. So here's some real examples. This is from individual participants, this relaxation time estimated from perturbation studies like that. That was me as a participant. So it's always, so it's in phase and then anti-phase, right? You see the increase. That's where the transition happens. When these triangles are filled, that's when you're switched. So you're on the right, you're switched. To think through that, you know, at high frequency, you have a better resolution of measuring relaxation time. So this is really conservative because you would get a better estimate and therefore a potentially lower estimate of relaxation time at high frequency. So it's a really significant effect. And this is the overall data across subjects for variability and for relaxation time. And the theory was actually able to predict, like from the slope of this, you can predict the slope of that without any free parameters, stuff like that. So it's really a solid piece of science. And so this fact was very important for us psychologically, because this means that stability is important. You can lose it. And so even if you've not lost it, it's important to be aware that it is there. It's a necessary and sufficient condition and so on. So all kind of logic about that. But what I want to drive at now is that it's also a signature of this postulated neural mechanism where each of these rhythms for the two fingers is driven by an oscillator, and their coupling leads to the pattern. In fact, the excitatory coupling leads to in phase, the inhibitory coupling to anti-phase. So for instance, this would be a variant of a model like that, where you could have coupling really just means that one of the oscillators shows up in the equation of the other, and vice versa, right? The first oscillator shows up in the equation of the second. And then you can try to understand how in phase and anti-phase comes about. So coupling will align phases. So if you have coupling and the two oscillators, the two line types here are misaligned, then after some time they will synchronize. Depending on the size, that will be a synchronization in phase or synchronization in anti-phase. And the let's skip that, but yeah, well, one can look at the phase picture. So phase would be analyzing the oscillators in the polar coordinates. Remember, you have phase and amplitude. Do that for the two oscillators, and then you subtract the two phase dynamics against each other, and what you generically get is something that has attractors in relative phase, and the instability would be where that attractor becomes the slope comes flat. Here's a picture of that. So it would be in phase. This is this phase dynamics, or this is phase against its rate of change. I might have been here, relative phase, yes. And there are two attractors. There's one at in phase, which remains stable. There's one at anti-phase, which then becomes unstable, becomes flat. And what I'm arguing now is that when that happens, when it becomes flat, the variance will increase. Why is that the case? Now, intuitively speaking, we never really discussed that in our tutorial because it didn't do stochastics. So noise is sort of a contribution to the rate of change. It would add a force, right? A stochastic force. And if you think of this dynamics, it would shift the dynamics up and down. And if it's relatively stable, the range, you know, the system would be perturbed by tracking the attractor, right? The attractor moves a little bit. And you see when it's quite stable, the attractor moves, you know, a certain amount that will induce a certain amount of variance. If you have the same noise and the flatter dynamics, then you will have more noise. It will move around in a broader range, and that's why, you know, at lower frequency, at you know, less stable, you will get more variance. This is called critical fluctuations by analogy with physics, even though the physical mechanism is a bit different. And similar for reaction time. So if you for relaxation time, so if you were to perturb, then the restoring force is much less for a you know, flatter slope than for a deeper slope. You've all solved the linear differential equation in our tutorial, remember, very back at the beginning of the course, and you saw the exponential relaxation, and that rate of exponential relaxation, that was a question of the slope of the dynamics, right? The closer the slope to zero, the slower the rate, the longer it takes to relax. And that's the reason why you see that. So I'm not explaining all the details of that, but the loss of stability, these signatures are a prediction of coupled oscillators behaving like that. And there's a lot more information about that I don't go into. And that is really the dominant theoretical picture now. Is maybe just a question in neuroscience, exactly which level are these in the brain or in the spinal cord. It turns out they're not in the spinal cord. It's a whole story about that. So I just wanted to answer finally Richard's question. So these were all cases where the two limbs were moving at the same frequency. It's just the relative phase that varies, right? And that is like a complication that one often doesn't even think of, that you can have a sort of a monorhythm that is only one frequency for all the components, but you can do it at different phases. In fact, there's a whole series of experiments where you impose phases like a little phase advance, and then you can also see how that is modulated by these coordination tendencies. What you were asking, I think, about is what about different frequencies, like establishing 2-to-1, like making 2 beats with this hand and 1 with that, which is quite intuitive that that is harder, and musicians struggle with that. It actually turns out that we do that usually just using in phase and anti-phase and just modulating the amplitude. For instance, you can do a 2-to-1 by having a synchronous 1-to-1 movement, and then you just rest one hand and do an extra cycle, right? Modulating the amplitude. I'm not very good at that, but you can imagine what one does, right? And so if you look at the space-time curves of the individual components, they're actually always either 1-to-1, so same frequency in phase or anti-phase, or and then one of the hands is turned off in a way for a half cycle. But with some practice, you can actually learn other coordination patterns, really 2-to-1 patterns of the 3-to-2, and there's a whole industry of people who have studied that. By training, you can stabilize these patterns, and then you have actually the detailed signatures of coupled oscillators. There's a whole mathematical field of oscillators, that so-called Arnold tongue, someone you might have heard of that, where you see that the range of stability of coupled oscillators in these different frequency ratios depends on how irrational the frequencies ratio is. So 1-to-1 is very stable, 1-to-2 is somewhat stable, 3-to-2 is stable, and then if it gets like 7-to-13, it becomes less and less stable, and you get smaller and smaller ranges of stability. And to a limited extent, this was explored in humans, and they don't go into this very complicated patterns, but you can say the more complex the frequency ratio, more the irrational, the more difficult to stabilize. And that overlaps with the experience of musicians who know that some of these more exotic, what do they call us? I don't know the technical term, when you have these ratios between different cycles in the music, which can also be 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 and so on. And there's sometimes more exotic ones are like 4-to-5 and so on. Those become much harder for musicians to play, and that corresponds into that. So one could say that the picture of coupled oscillator explains why it is so hard to produce non-harmonic or non-trivial polyrhythms, which I think is what your question was. And currently we think that it is actually largely cortical, even though the subcortical structure does contribute to that, that these timers are in the brain, in cortex. So the brain, the subspinal cord does have central pattern generators, which just means periodically bursting neurons, and they are probably important for some fixed patterns, like in locomotion. But these sort of voluntary kinds of rhythms, they really are cortical and supraspinal, certainly. While maybe in some animals that could be different, but we humans are well known to be not as spinal as many of our other animal friends. Okay, I have to watch the time a little bit. So this is how far I want to take that analogy to human movement. So now I'll go back to robotics and see what we can learn from these ideas. So I'll be telling this now from the perspective of my own work. There are other people like Kodicek and so on that you see that goes back further, and there's a mix. It has been going back and forth between these different communities. A lot of the early robotic work that I was referring to was locomotory in nature, or interacting with the ground, and there specific other things are at work. For instance, gravity is part of the oscillator. Gravity is sort of the restoring force of the grandfather clock, right? That establishes the cycle of the pendulum. And so some of these hopping robots are based on that, on the timing that emerges from being a gravitationally accelerated body. And now I'll show you where that's not the case, where you're really doing the timer as a just a model that you have in your computational architecture, and it's not the physical timer of the periphery. So you don't mix that with control as much. So this was old work I did when I was in Marseille with someone called Cristina Santos. And that was literally using that Hopf oscillator, that one that I just reminded you of. The Hopf oscillator, here's written out. We used fixed negative damping here, and the omega was varied to get the frequency. And it was normalized to have amplitude 1. We would then multiply the oscillator with whatever amplitude we needed for that. The Hopf normal form is ideal in that it has an analytical solution, so you can really determine the parameters to be the ones that you want. So we could impose the cycle time of this oscillator, and we could also make sure that we know at which phase it starts and we end it. So the only parameter that was varied here was the frequency, the timing. And then we also had the notion that we would start and stop it. So at this time, we used a very crude system where we had some initial position in it. And this is a fixed point attractor that would put the system into, X has an attracted X in it. And here I have some final position, X final, with some, stability. And you see these terms here in front, the U terms, those are sort of neurons. At the time, these weren't really neural dynamics, but some kind of indicator variables or logical, we call those Boolean logical variables that would be 0 or 1, and we would switch them around to switch on and off the different oscillators. Now you see it becomes very concrete how we switch an oscillator on or off. So, for instance, to start a movement, we would switch off the init and switch on this one in the sense of going from 0 to 1. And this one would be off all the time. And then the system would make an oscillation. And at some point during the oscillation, we would switch this off and switch this one on, and then it would just go to the final position. And adding Gaussian white noise, we often added noise to just probe these equations. And so the way these switches worked were actually also dynamic systems, sort of like neurons, right? But we didn't use neural dynamics. We used instead this normal form of the pitchfork bifurcation, sort of analogous. See, the u squared times u is sort of like the pitchfork bifurcation, the third order term, and then there's a linear term. And so this was based on having analytical solutions for that, so that depending on the parameter values here that we inject here, we could make sure that the system has the right bifurcation at the right time. So it was kind of very engineered. So that was a system that we could steer to have the right, to start the oscillation at the right time, have the right cycle time, and then turn off, or in this case, actually sometimes go back to the original position, so as to control a simulated robot arm that was supposed to intersect an object, catching task. It was just simulated. So here's an example of that actually working. So for instance, here timing variable is sitting at 0. So this is sort of the velocity-like variable. This is the positional variable. So, and then has to be rescaled and to be mapped onto the physics. So the positional variable would go from -1 to +1. And this is when we would give the signal to start, which would mean that the neuron for init goes off. So there's a little delay between the signal, which is the parameter that goes into the neuron, and the neuron, we call it neuron, this variable itself to turn off. So really the movement starts at this point. This is in a sense the reaction time, the oscillator to the neural dynamics to switch. So the oscillator goes on, the oscillator is on for this time interval, and the system has reached the target value. So this is a timing planning, right? We arrive smoothly at the desired endpoint, we even softly, as controlled by this neural dynamics, the switching dynamics. So we switch off a little earlier, and that there's the delay. So the time when you switch, the parameter that you do that has to be approximately right for this to run its course. It doesn't depend very precisely on that. That is, you can shift this around and the oscillator will still behave like that based on the property of the vector fields, essentially based on the property that this vector field from this equation is not so different from that vector field. So when you switch it off, it will continue to the attractor that lies on the limit cycle, and you don't see the difference between switching on and off. So that's why the timing of the switching isn't so critical. You have a whole interval where you can do it. So that's how the precise time course is generated from the oscillator, not from the switching mechanism. And so the proof of concept was then that this system would be able to intercept. So it's all in simulation. So we would have a ball approach. This is the position of the ball relative to the oscillator, and it's characterized in terms of time to contact. Time to contact is the time it would need to reduce distance to 0 given constant velocity of the ball. And the ball could actually vary velocity, but we would always estimate the instantaneous time to contact. So we had the threshold value of this time to contact. Below that threshold value, we would start the oscillation that is given a signal here to the system for the neurons to switch. They would then switch. The record moves to an interception point, which it reaches here. And then we actually started the initiation of a return movement where the record would return to its original position. And we added a lot of noise to that ball trajectory to prove that this stabilizes against noise. And you see that actually some of these Boolean variables get very noisy inputs, but the stable attractor of the neural dynamics, in a sense, the switching dynamics, filters that away and the system smoothly moves. And maybe I'll do this. Let me see how to do that. We're sort of out of time. Maybe I'll just, maybe I'll close here and I'll open next week with these more advanced examples. And this way I have a little bit of time to discuss with you. So next week, I'll show you a couple more, these sort of the more advanced uses of this kind of technology.